So, good morning. Good morning, you. It's a great pleasure to have you today.
Morning, Val.
Well, I heard rumors that you have a new edition of your rather famous book, Using Geochemical Data, coming out, and I wanted to take the opportunity to kind of speak with you about that.
That's great. No, I shall enjoy this.
Wonderful. So I prepared a small summary of your background for our listeners and the students, and with your permission, I'll quickly kind of read that out. So
Okay.
Professor Hugh Rollinson, is an emeritus professor in earth sciences at the University of Derby. And you're the author of, well, the famous book, Using Geochemical Data. And you graduated from Oxford in 1971, and subsequently you worked for the Geological Survey of Sierra Leone until 1975. You then started a PhD at Leicester, which was awarded in 1978, and you did a postdoc in Leeds. After that, you worked at Gloucestershire, Zimbabwe, and Sultan Qaboos University in Oman. And in 2008, you moved to Derby, where you've been professor in earth sciences and the head of the department as well. So your research interests are mainly on early Earth and early processes on planet Earth and the geochemical background to this. And you've been to quite some illustrious places, working in Scotland and in Africa, in West and Southern Africa, Greenland, Russia. And well, I'm quite impressed by your CV. So, and I'd love to take the opportunity to ask you a few questions about the upcoming book that is now coming in a new edition, together with Vicky Peace from Stockholm University. And I'm really looking forward to this new book. So I hope it's okay if I ask you a few questions about it.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Great. Well, here's my first question, and I will publish the questions in the box below so people can follow this up. But Using Geochemical Data, the book, was one of my favorite course texts. And here it is. Here's my old favorite course text from my student days, which I bought in the late 90s. And it's rather worn out. You see all the notes here and things. So, and it was the go-to book when it came to interpreting geochemical data to quantify processes. So I always wondered about the person behind the book and what inspired you to actually write this book. So this is my first question.
Yeah.
What drove you to write this book, which I think is a fantastic book?
Yes, well, in order to answer that question, I need to tell you one or two stories about how
Please go ahead.
things evolved. Early in my career, I was working on some komatiites from the greenstone belts in Sierra Leone, where I'd worked in the Geological Survey, and which I'd studied in my postdoc. And I had this data set, and I was very concerned about the possibility of element mobility in these rocks. And so I was doing some ratio correlation work when I was in the University of Gloucestershire. And one day, a colleague of mine put her head over my shoulder and said, "You can't do that. It's statistically invalid." She was a hydrologist, and she said, "Look, this methodology just doesn't work." And so we wrote this up as a paper back in the 70s in Contributions and published a short piece on ratio correlation. And I think that was the article which probably drew the late Keith Cox's attention to some of the work and some of the thinking that I'd been doing. And I don't really know what went on behind the scenes, but I had an approach from a chap called Ian Francis, who is a commissioning editor, then working for the publisher Longman, which has now disappeared. And he asked me if I would be interested in writing a more general piece on how we use and how we interpret geochemical data. And so between us, we put this book concept together, and I was given a contract to write it. And the fortuitous thing was, as you and maybe many other academics know, finding time to write a book is very difficult in the middle of a busy academic career, also in the middle of a busy personal life, bringing up children and running a household and so on. But just at that time, I moved to work in the University of Zimbabwe. And so for 3 years, I was living in a rented house, so I didn't need to worry about maintenance and all that sort of thing. And I had more time than I would have otherwise had to actually do the writing, well, to do the reading and the research and the writing. And so these two things came together in a rather fortuitous way, which meant by the time I left Zimbabwe, I had a book manuscript prepared and ready for publication. So that's the story behind the book. It was a series of serendipitous events which brought the book together.
That's really interesting. I mean, this is the kind of story I would have loved to hear, but of course, one doesn't know that as a reader. But so the book actually kind of formed in a number of places, with Zimbabwe being one of the key places where it was written, the original version.
That's right. Yes, it was. Yes, yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
This is great. No, the book is extremely useful, and I can see that you covered a lot of these aspects, the problems geochemists encounter when they work with data. And this is, I guess, one of the key strengths that I always felt. But now let me move on to the second question. The first edition had a really long history, and it was a classic, at least since the mid to late 90s. When I was a student, and it was certainly a great resource for me personally. So what has changed from back then to today, and what has changed in the actual new edition of the book?
Okay, well, what happened for a long time was, from time to time, somebody said, you should write a second edition. And I said, no, I won't write a second edition. It's too much work. You know, it's like writing a new book. So much has changed. And then, just as I was leaving the University of Derby, in 1 year, I had 4 different approaches from different publishers saying, would you be interested in doing a second edition? And that prompted me to think, okay, well, now I'm beginning to think about retirement. Maybe that would be something I could do. But still, it was a huge, huge task. And in the end, I thought, well, I could do this if I could do it with somebody rather than just do it by myself. And I was in a conversation with Vicky Pease, whom some of your students will know from Stockholm.
Absolutely.
And we agreed that it would be a project that we could actually do together. She would bring her expertise in tectonics and geochronology, and I would bring my expertise, and together we would write a new edition. Now, that process and getting a contract sorted took quite a long time, but that was how the second edition came as a concept into being. But then we had to sit down and think about all the things, as you say, that have changed in the more than 25 years since the first edition came out. And a huge amount has changed. I mean, not least, there are many other good geochemical texts out there. The Treatise of Geochemistry and its multiple volumes, 2 editions of that. I mean, that is a vast resource, and there's no way we're ever going to be able to compete with that, although we do refer to it a lot. But perhaps more fundamentally, the technology of geochemistry has changed incredibly in 25 years. So new techniques have been developed, particularly in the area of isotope geology, but trace element geochemistry has become so much more precise, and a much wider range of elements are available now at very high levels of precision. And along with that, along with, if you like, the practical and experimental side of geochemistry, there's been a much richer understanding of the theory behind geochemistry, particularly with things like trace elements and so on. And so our understanding of how trace element partition coefficients might be derived, and some of the crystal lattice modeling that's gone on, is all a huge new leap forward in terms of a theoretical understanding that is available now to your average graduate student. In addition, you must remember that that first edition was written before we had the massive amount of personal computing that we now have on our desks. So I wrote this first edition in my bedroom at night while my wife was trying to go to sleep on an Amstrad computer. And every now and then I would print out some pages, and it was a dot matrix printer that made a dreadful noise, and it would whir away and print out a few more pieces of paper from which you then tore off the strips of dots on either side. But along with the technology that we have in word processing, the whole idea of data processing, large data sets, if you like, big data, has come to geochemistry. So there's been an explosion, not just in technology, but in the data that technology has produced. So we have an enormous amount of data now, and associated with that is the computing that goes with it. And not least, of course, access to the literature. I mean, there's been an explosion in geochemical journals as well. So there's a vast amount of literature to read, but the benefit is we can access it easily with online resources available for most journals. And so there's more to access, but there are better techniques. And so this new edition has had to bring all that together. It says a little bit about the issues related to big data, and I'm myself not convinced that that is a helpful way forward, but we can talk about that if you like. But all these things together have compounded to make it a much more interesting but more complex field. And you can see we needed to be at least 2 authors. Perhaps we should have been more authors, and it should have been an edited book. Maybe that'll be the 3rd edition, I don't know. So we've tried to draw on all these resources and update the book in all these different ways. But we've also changed very slightly in the way in which we perceive geochemical data. And this is reflected in the way we've written the subtitle. In the 1st edition, it was all about interpreting and analysing the data. The subtle shift now is that we see geochemical data as a tool to understand geological processes. Mm-hmm. And so we've put that in the title now to deliberately draw the potential reader to the idea that what they're doing is a step along the way. Geochemical data are a means to an end. They are not an end in themselves. And it's the understanding of geological processes that we are trying to get a handle on. So that's where we've gone in our 2nd edition.
Very good. No, I can appreciate the kind of complexity, the enormous task, and that having a partner is enormously helpful here. So from my own experience, having somebody to discuss things with, to bounce off ideas, and actually learning from a partner is vital. So I'm delighted to see that you and Vicky were able to team up and bring this to fruition. This is really kind of amazing. And I'd love to pick your brain on this big data issue, but maybe we'll keep that for the end, because I'd love to go through the questions first of all to kind of keep our flow and rhythm, because the next question actually, it builds on what you've just said. Partly you answered my next question already. So science moves on is the next question, and especially geochemical techniques are developing so rapidly. So the question is, how have you personally actually managed to keep up with this? This is one of these things that I hear students and that also more experienced researchers struggling a lot with that the vast amount of information that we're confronted with is a real challenge. How are you managing this personally?
Well, I think the reader of the book will be the judge as to whether or not I have done. But of course, as I mentioned, there have been 2 of us at this project. And so we both come with different backgrounds. And so, of course, we have our own networks, our own experiences of research and so on. But there's a couple of things I would point to. I've worked on quite a diverse range of topics. As you mentioned in my CV, a number of years ago, I went to live in Oman, and suddenly I was working on Cretaceous ophiolites instead of Archean rocks, which has been the major part of my career. And so I was suddenly working with a different group of people, thinking about different sorts of problems, trying to understand the relatively recent mantle and oceanic processes, whereas before I'd been thinking very much more about ancient processes leading to the formation of the crust. So this diversity of research interests is one strand which has forced me to think broadly about geochemistry and geochemical techniques. The other thing I would point to is that in all the jobs that I've done, I've worked largely in teaching focused universities. So I've had to carry a heavy teaching load wherever I've worked. And this forces you to read widely because I've been teaching a very wide range of subjects, all the way across from environmental geology, economic geology, economic geology, igneous petrology, geochemistry, and so on. And if you're teaching this, particularly if you're teaching it at third year level, you do need to be aware of what's going on in a very broad range of fields. So whereas working in a teaching intensive university means you don't have too much time for research, the good side is it does stretch you in terms of the breadth of your understanding and your knowledge. I suppose the other thing is because of the different areas in which I've worked, geographically and geologically, I've worked with a diverse range of people. And so in rubbing shoulders with lots of different people with different interests, you begin to pick up an understanding of where geochemistry is going. So the reader will know, will quickly understand there are some things I'm more deeply into than others. But I hope the book gives a flavour of the breadth of modern geochemistry and the things that we are capable of doing with our data when we've got it. And I guess that's the thrust of the book.
Very good. And this brings me right to my final question, and that is because of this huge success. I mean, the book has been out there for 30 years by now, and I checked it out on Google. It's got almost 7,000 citations on Google Scholar. So it's been hugely successful.
Well, that's incredible. It's gone up since when I wrote the proposal for the second edition. I said it had about 5,000 citations, but it's gone up to 7 now. That's pretty good.
It's this morning I checked and it was 6,900 or something like that. Yeah. I mean, close to 7,000 in any case. So
it's funny on the website ResearchGate, I get a notification every time they find a citation, and there are times when 1 or 2 citations come in each week, and I think, yes, gosh, it's clocking up. Cited by very, very diverse people. If you were to look at where it's cited, journals from around the world, Asia, Africa, as well as Europe and so on. But yes, it's interesting.
This is wonderful. And particularly since it's, excuse me, particularly since it's cited so widely, that this makes it such a fantastic success story, to me at least. I mean, if you write a paper and it's cited a few hundred times, it's a massive success, but this is thousands of times for an individual item. Wow, what a success story.
You see, the thing that disappoints me though is that book has got more citations than all my published articles added together.
Well, I mean, the book is a real hit, so I mean, we must accept that, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
And in part, you kind of addressed this, of course, but I'm going to ask it very explicitly now. What do you think is the real secret of this success? So that young researchers, early career researchers can learn something from, your magic toolkit. What do you think is the real kind of secret of the success of using geochemical data?
Well, I think maybe it's, as a university teacher, as you know, you will sometimes have to teach things that you haven't worked on, and you have to learn them up. And so you yourself are the student for a while. You're looking at a methodology and you're thinking, I don't understand this. I need to get my head around it because I've got to explain it. And in part, that's what happened when I wrote the first edition. There were things that I didn't really understand, and I had to dig deep and hard into the literature to understand what people were saying in order that I could then explain it to the reader. And so because I myself was the learner in some aspects of this subject, I was then able to explain it, hopefully, in a way that was intelligible. And when I came across things that were inconsistent, then I was having to either highlight these in the text or dig deep until it became clear. I mean, nowadays it's taken for granted that when you are doing some normalization of, say, isotope data, certainly back in the 70s, there were a number of different schemes that different labs were using, and you had to look very carefully at the small print to make sure that, for instance, if you were calculating epsilon neodymium, you were using the same values that the authors had done in their paper in order to compare your data with somebody else's. And it was suddenly things like this, when you suddenly realize, goodness me, there's a lab in America doing this, and there's a lab in Oxford doing this, and they're not the same. And I need to alert the reader to the fact that they need to be very careful if they're going to make any sense out of their data. So it's little things like that that you pick up as you go along by reading widely and comparing, reading the bits of papers that we often ignore, the methodology section, and looking in detail at what people have done in the lab in order to get their numbers. So it's careful attention to that sort of detail, which I think is perhaps one of the things that has made the book useful and hopefully stopped people falling into traps. I would just add that one of the big traps that our first edition led people into, that we've been a bit concerned about, is using discrimination diagrams. The whole idea that in igneous petrology, you can select a few trace elements, plot them on a graph, and out pops a tectonic setting. Oh, this is definitely an arc, or this is definitely an ocean island. And we've been aware that this approach has been much abused by authors, not used in a thinking way when seeking to interpret their data. And
I'm so glad you say that, because I was pointing this out to my students for many years. Please go on. Sorry for interrupting. So.
Yeah, but we've been very careful, Vicky and I, working on the whole business of discrimination diagrams to point out to users the validity of diagrams, the usefulness of diagrams, and particularly that section of the book is completely different. It is completely rewritten, and there are quite a number of warnings and caveats in the text, so that the reader doesn't run away with the idea that this is a quick fix to solving a geological problem. You know, you've got a bunch of metamorphosed basalts, and you think you're going to be able to tell the reader of your paper they formed in an arc setting, when you don't really have any of the geological context. We urge great caution in that. I mean, that's just one little example, but it is indicative of the level of rewriting that we've had to do in the production of this second edition.
That makes absolute sense to me. While I perfectly appreciate the usefulness of the discrimination diagrams, but without having the background on the geology, without having a careful assessment of element mobility in a certain setting or a certain suite of rocks, it's very, very tricky, and it can be very misleading. And I've seen it a lot that people were using just a set of up to 20 different discrimination diagrams, and then it's the majority that wins, kind of, in terms of the tectonic setting. If it's 12 times this and 8 times that, then it's most likely, and you kind of go, oh, please, this is not quite how I think it ought to be done. So I'm delighted to hear that this has been carefully addressed by you two now in the new edition. Fantastic. Yes. This is wonderful. Now, if you don't mind, I'll pick you up on your offer from earlier to talk for a minute or two about the big data issue, because this is something that's it's quite important these days because of the increase in computing power and the ability to manage large databases. Some geochemists certainly think that this is the way forward. And would you be able to comment on that? Because you said you're not always sure it works in the best sense of things. So could I have your view on that, please?
Yes. Well, look, here's a caveat. If you're working in exploration geochemistry and you've got tens of thousands of data points and you're looking for statistical anomalies which might help you in terms of a search for deposits of economic significance, then this is perhaps a way forward. But one of the things we emphasize in the book, and it's been part of my own personal mantra, is the importance of geological fieldwork, that the geological field control of samples is fundamental. I remember years ago making a grant application, which was rejected. And one of the reviewers wrote, "This is simply a smash and grab raid." And very often we conduct smash and grab raids. We run around the world, collect a bunch of rocks, and then we take them to pieces using every esoteric technique we can, but we fail sometimes to see the geology in its context. And I've been lucky enough to live in at least 3 different countries for a number of years, and to be able to do research and fieldwork in those countries, and then look at the results of the geochemistry in the context in which the samples were found. And I would cite one particular example. I was looking at some felsic melts, which were found as dikes in mantle rocks in the Oman ophiolite. And I was very keen to see whether these felsic melts had interacted with the mantle. And I collected, I think, 12 samples only. But because those samples were so carefully collected with very good field control, in my paper, I have a little map of where the samples come from. They were able to give us a very clear indication of what the story was in terms of crustal mantle interaction in this particular setting. Now, we could have gone into the area and collected 100 samples from all over the place and probably got a slightly more confused story than the one that we got with just 12 samples. So this is my argument about big data. Sometimes big data isn't helpful because what we want is very specific sample collecting with a very well demarcated field control. And when that is in place, then we don't need, the 100 samples or the 1,000 samples from the area. They're irrelevant. Now, I suspect somebody can persuade me that there are cases where we do need these large numbers of samples, but I would argue to solve specific problems like the one I was looking at, small is better as long as the samples are well chosen. So that's my commentary.
I think you hit the nail on the head here. I think to answer specific questions, that's the way to go, I would generally think as well. And sometimes I'm very skeptical when it comes to certain ranges being quoted for certain types of rocks judged from large databases, because I wonder, these extreme values, what are they really reflecting? Have people taken care? Has alteration been considered? Is this a special case that goes in there? And it's very hard to kind of really assess this carefully. While if you have a more dedicated focus study, one can actually get a much clearer picture when it comes to these detailed questions. But of course, there is applications where large, big data sets are useful, no doubt about it. But I think the question is very important. The specific question is probably better answered with a specific set of carefully chosen rocks. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this. I really enjoyed that. And I think just at the very end, I'd like to quickly take our listeners to the actual webpage where you can buy the book, if that's okay. So I'll share my screen in an effort of promoting your work. And here we go. So share. So I hope you can see the screen now. This is now the webpage for buying the new book, Using Geochemical Data by Hugh Rollinson and Victoria Peace. And it's Cambridge University Press, and you can recommend it to your librarian here, and you can buy the book as a print copy, if you will, and probably also electronically. So this is where you have to go in order to get that. So now I'm back with you.
I must just add that from that webpage, you'll see the electronic version is due out in April next month. I'm not sure when the print copy is going to be available. I thought that would also be available in April. And if I remember rightly, and the listener needs to check on this, I think the price for the paperback copy is £50. Do you have that there?
It doesn't state a price here on the webpage where I am, but
Okay.
£50 sounds quite affordable to me for
Yes,
the kind of content you're offering. So
early on in the marketing, they were putting it up at £50. Maybe they've changed their mind. I don't know.
well, let's see about that. But now it says that it's going to be available soon. So April sounds very good. So
Yep.
I think a lot of people are waiting for it. Certainly I am, because this is falling apart, this old version.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, that brings me to the end of this. I would like to thank you for your time and talking with me about your new book. And I wish you big success with the book and for your career as well, and that the new edition brings as many citations as the old one, at least, if not more.
Sure. Well, thanks, Val, very much for the opportunity to talk about it.
My pleasure. All the very best to you. Bye-bye.
Okay, goodbye. Yes.